Deep in Alabama's cotton fields, where summer could kill you and secrets rotted like infected wounds, there was a plantation that would become known for terrible evil. The Daniels estate held 13 enslaved people and looked like any other farm in the pre-war South. But underneath this normal appearance, Festus Daniels lived a life that turned human beings into toys for his twisted pleasure. What started as whispers about a cruel master would expose horrors that went far beyond slavery's usual violence. This is the terrifying tale of total power destroying a human being's soul. A story that disturbs me not just because of what happened, but because each new truth completely changes how we see everything. Where are you right now as you watch this? Is this your first time here? Drop a comment below. And if this story touches something deep inside you, think about subscribing for more tales that dig into humanity's darkest places. Because sometimes what looks like one nightmare hides something far worse underneath. The Daniels farm spread across Alabama's hills, a cotton plantation that didn't stand out from dozens of others nearby. In 1848, 40-year-old Festus Daniels took over his father's land with a dozen slaves and a name as a hard worker. To everyone around him, he carried on a respectable family tradition. But even as a boy, strange things worried the people close to him. When he was 8, someone found him in the barn cutting open a living cat, saying he wanted to see how it worked inside. His mother Martha found him with bloody hands, staring with fascination as the dying animal twitched. They kept it quiet, calling it childish curiosity, but more incidents followed. He built simple traps to catch small animals and keep them alive for days while he watched how they acted under terrible stress. He spent hours seeing how long each creature took to die from no water, no food, or from wounds he gave them. At 12, his experiments became more elaborate and cruel. He discovered he could keep rats alive for weeks by barely feeding them while cutting off small pieces of their bodies. This fascinated him. He tested different ways of causing pain, studying their reactions and learning where the line was between agony and death through trial and error. Dustin was born in 1832 and from early on saw his father's strange habits. When the boy turned 8, his father decided it was time to teach him about power and control. He forced the child to watch his animal experiments, explaining how strong men needed to understand suffering to control it properly. The boy felt sick and disgusted at first, but Festus saw these feelings as weakness that needed fixing. He started testing the boy himself, starving him for days or making him stand still in the sun for hours. Each test left marks on the young man's body that would stay forever. By age 10, the boy learned to hide his feelings, creating a blank face that satisfied his father. Festus thought this meant his teaching worked, not realizing he'd created a son who feared him deeply and secretly questioned everything he did. When the boy turned 12, Festus made him join in the cruel acts with slaves. It started small but grew worse. The boy learned to obey to avoid becoming a victim himself, but each forced action left emotional wounds that would never heal. Martha Daniels watched her son change with growing horror, but couldn't do anything to stop it. She married Jeremiah Daniels in 1805 when she was just 16. Her father, a broke merchant from Mobile, saw the marriage as a way to save the family from total ruin. The young woman became part of a deal that would pay off her father's debts. The marriage was never happy. Jeremiah treated his wife like property, and she quickly learned to submit to avoid fights. When her son was born in 1807, she hoped motherhood would give her empty life some meaning. Instead, she discovered she'd given birth to something that slowly terrified her. As the boy grew, his mother noticed he showed no normal love. When she accidentally hurt herself, he studied her like she was an animal being examined. He showed fascination with blood and pain, asking detailed questions about what she felt. During his teenage years, the woman became extremely nervous. Neighbors saw how she avoided being alone with him, always finding excuses to leave when Jeremiah traveled. Her hands shook constantly, and she checked door locks over and over before bed. In 1844, Martha was found dead in the barn, supposedly after falling from the upper beams. They called it an accident caused by her growing mental problems, but some details never made sense. The ropes she supposedly used to climb were cut strangely, and marks on her neck didn't match a fall. At 37, Festus showed remarkable calm at the funeral. He didn't cry, telling mourners his mother finally found peace. Jeremiah died 2 years later from pneumonia, leaving everything to his son. Among Th. Plantation slaves lived an old man named Samuel who'd worked there over 40 years. He'd arrived young during Jeremiah's father's time and seen 3 generations of the Daniels family. The elder had quiet wisdom and detailed memories of things others wanted to forget. He watched the young master grow with increasing worry, recognizing signs of evil beyond slavery's normal cruelty. He kept what he knew to himself, understanding that speaking out could mean death. But he guarded family secrets that would one day become crucial to understanding the full horror on this plantation. The first change after taking over was building several small structures at the back of the farm. He claimed they were for storing tools. Really, these buildings would let him expand his cruel activities without outside interference. At first, the slaves noticed no big changes in how they were treated. He kept the routines his father had established, showing management skills that impressed other owners nearby. He clearly understood that looking stable on the outside was essential for his private activities. Slowly, small changes appeared. He created a punishment system that seemed way too harsh for minor mistakes. A slave who arrived 5 minutes late could be forced to stand motionless in the sun for hours while he watched the effects of losing water. He developed specific punishments for different types of disobedience, each designed to cause maximum discomfort without damage that would hurt their ability to work. He discovered that taking away sleep, exposing them to weather, and isolating them could break their will without leaving visible marks. The slaves started realizing he had genuine interest in how they reacted to suffering. He asked detailed questions about physical feelings during punishments, carefully examining different responses to pain. Some understood that punishments lasted longer not because of anger, but because he enjoyed watching agony. Among the slaves, 2 siblings stood out for both their skills and their closeness. Flora, 20 years old, worked in the main house as a servant, while her brother Elijah, 23, supervised work in the cotton fields. Both were born on the plantation and knew the Daniels family's peculiarities intimately. The young woman had beauty that didn't go unnoticed, with delicate features that contrasted with her harsh life. She learned to move silently through the house, avoiding unnecessary attention. Her natural intelligence helped her predict what the master needed before he asked. Her brother shared her intelligence but used it to organize farm work. He maximized other slaves' productivity while minimizing conflicts with the owner. His natural leadership earned respect from both fellow slaves and the master. The relationship between the siblings was exceptionally close, forged by needing to protect each other. In their hostile world, they developed ways to communicate through simple looks and gestures, creating a bond that went beyond normal relationships among slaves. This closeness would soon draw the owner's attention in ways neither could predict. During winter 1853, he began examining the siblings with renewed interest. He noticed how they protected each other, how they anticipated each other's needs, and how their bonds seemed to go beyond normal slave relationships. For a mind like his, this dynamic represented a fascinating opportunity. He started creating situations that tested the limits of their loyalty. He developed small traps that forced one to choose between their own safety and protecting the other. He analyzed these interactions with the same intensity he'd given his animal experiments. The main house reflected its owner's personality in subtle but disturbing ways. He kept a collection of animal bones in his office, carefully organized. He claimed interest in anatomy, but the true nature of his fascination was obvious to any careful observer. Working daily in the house, the young woman began noticing details others missed. She saw small crude medical tools hidden in drawers, notebooks with basic body drawings, and a persistent smell of rot that seemed to come from the basement. She learned to clean around these items without touching them, developing sharp awareness of the owner's moods. The first clear sign of the owner's true nature came on a cold January morning in 1854 when he decided to test how much a human could stand the cold. Moses, a slave who'd committed the minor mistake of breaking a farm tool, was chosen for an experiment that would last 3 days. He built a small outdoor cell just large enough for Moses to stand but not sit or lie down. He positioned it where direct winds would hit, stripped the man, and left him there with only water to drink. He visited every 2 hours, watching changes in the victim's body and enjoying what he saw. During the first day, Moses kept his dignity, refusing to beg or show weakness. He examined with sadistic pleasure how the human body reacted to extreme cold. He noticed the shaking, the skin color changes, and the first signs of mental confusion. He asked questions about sensations, forcing Moses to describe every aspect of his torture. On the second day, Moses's resistance started breaking. He introduced variations in the test, offering blankets in exchange for information about other slaves, testing how hope and despair affected the ability to endure pain. He discovered he could play with mental suffering as easily as physical. Watching from the main house window, the young servant was forced to witness this while doing her tasks. He deliberately positioned the cell where she could see, taking delight in examining her reactions as much as Moses's. He noticed how she tried to hide her distress, how her hands shook when serving meals. At 22, Dustin watched his father's cruelty with a mix of familiar dread and deep guilt. He had vivid memories of his own forced participation in similar acts during his youth when he was made to hold tools or watch victims closely. The marks on his arms and back ached whenever he witnessed new horrors. Working in the fields, the servant's brother could hear Moses's occasional moans carried by the wind. The agony of helplessly watching a fellow slave's torment was almost as intense as Moses's physical experience. He created multiple layers of suffering with a single action. On the third day, delirium took Moses, switching between incoherent begging and complete silence. He watched each phase of mental breakdown with fascination, intrigued by how the human mind broke under extreme pressure. He confirmed his discovery that mental resistance could be broken without causing permanent physical damage. When Moses was finally freed, he monitored the recovery with the same sadistic interest. He noted how trauma affected not only Moses but all other slaves who witnessed it. Fear spread through the plantation like disease, exactly as he wanted. The cruelties became more frequent and elaborate. He developed a pattern ensuring all slaves would eventually participate either as direct victims or forced witnesses. He discovered that waiting for suffering was almost as effective as the act itself for keeping absolute control. He started noticing subtle changes in his behavior toward the young servant. He examined her with different intensity, making comments about her appearance that left her deeply uncomfortable. Her household tasks gradually expanded to include cleaning areas of the house she'd never seen before. One of these areas was the basement, where he kept more permanent collections. The young woman discovered a gruesome display of human bones mixed with animal bones, organized in a way suggesting comparison. The smell of rot was almost unbearable, but she was forced to clean around these terrible displays. He casually explained that the human bones came from slaves who died on the plantation over the years, claiming interest in body differences. But the young woman noticed some bones showed cut marks not consistent with natural death, suggesting some deaths were hastened for his collections. During these months, her brother began suspecting she was facing additional pressures. She tried hiding her distress, but he knew her stress signals too well. The closeness between the siblings intensified as they supported each other against their lives' growing nightmare. He analyzed this dynamic with growing interest. He noticed how the siblings communicated through simple glances, how they anticipated each other's needs, and how their bond seemed to give them strength other slaves didn't have. For his sadistic mind, this relationship represented a unique opportunity. In March 1854, he decided to directly test the limits of their loyalty. He created a situation where the young woman was accused of stealing food from the pantry, a false accusation he carefully prepared. The punishment would be severe, but he offered her brother a chance to take the blame instead. Her brother immediately offered to accept the punishment, exactly as predicted. But instead of simply transferring it, he decided to punish both, claiming his willingness to lie was an additional offense. He created a situation where brotherly love became a source of amplified torment. The punishment involved forcing the siblings to remain tied in uncomfortable positions where they could see each other but not touch or speak. He kept them like this for 2 days, watching how the distress of seeing the other suffer was more intense than their own physical discomfort. He discovered a new form of mental torture. During this time, he examined how shared suffering affected individual resistance. He noticed the siblings tried hiding their own pain to spare the other, creating a cycle of self-sacrifice that prolonged both their agonies. This was exactly the type of dynamic that fascinated his disturbed mind. After freeing the siblings, he studied them with renewed interest. He'd identified a specific weakness he could exploit in much more elaborate ways. The bond between them wasn't just a weak point, it was a tool he could use to create unprecedented mental experiments. The other plantation slaves began avoiding the siblings, not from cruelty but from survival instinct. Everyone knew special interest had developed in them, and being close could mean inclusion in the experiments. Social isolation became another layer of pressure. The young woman began having recurring nightmares about the bones in the basement, dreaming she recognized some skulls as belonging to people she'd known. She often woke in panic but shared these terrors with no one but her brother. Knowledge of the owner's true activities was corroding her mental stability. In turn, her brother secretly began planning ways to protect his sister, even if it meant his own destruction. He considered attacking the owner, knowing he'd be killed but hoping it might somehow free his sister. It was desperate logic born of absolute despair. During April 1854, he started making subtle changes in the plantation routine to increase pressure on the young woman specifically. He assigned her tasks that kept her isolated for longer periods, creating opportunities for private surveillance that left her increasingly anxious. Her tasks expanded to include cleaning all his structures, forcing her to confront evidence of his cruelty daily. She found crude tools, blood stains that never fully came out, and occasionally small personal objects from slaves who mysteriously disappeared. He monitored how this constant exposure to terror affected her, studying changes in her behavior, posture, and facial expressions. He was conducting a long-term experiment on the effects of prolonged trauma, using her as the main subject. The pressure was building in a calculated way, creating conditions that would inevitably lead to a crisis. He'd learned that the most interesting experiments happened when victims were pushed beyond their limits, and the young woman was rapidly approaching that breaking point. The elderly slave monitored all these developments with growing concern. He'd seen generations of cruelty on the Daniels plantation, but recognized the current owner represented evil beyond anything previous. He guarded family secrets that could explain much, but revealing this knowledge could cost his life. What the owner didn't know was that his careful watching missed a crucial element. While he concentrated on the dynamic between the siblings, another relationship was developing in the plantation's shadows, one that would complicate his plans in ways even his calculating mind couldn't predict. Subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America if you want to see how this nightmare unfolds. In May 1854, the young servant began showing behaviors that deeply intrigued the owner. She disappeared for unexplainable periods during her tasks, always returning with elaborate excuses about household problems needing extra attention. At first, he interpreted this as his experiments working. When she disappeared for 3 full hours on a Tuesday afternoon without reasonable explanation, his sadistic curiosity transformed into something much more dangerous. He'd spent years studying human behavior under pressure, and could recognize when someone was hiding something significant. He noticed the disappearances always happened at the same times and decided to follow her one day. He saw her walking toward an abandoned area of the plantation where an old tool cabin had been forgotten since his father's time. As he approached, he heard voices coming from inside the structure. The cabin's location in a natural depression surrounded by dense trees made it practically invisible from the main house and work fields. He hid behind a nearby tree, waiting to discover what she was doing in that isolated place. What he saw filled him with rage. Few events in his life had managed to awaken. The young woman was having secret meetings with the owner's own son. The 22-year-old, who should have been supervising work in a distant section of the plantation, was involved in an intimate relationship with the slave. For the owner, this discovery represented a betrayal beyond any experiment he'd conducted. His son had inherited his mother's appearance with delicate features contrasting his father's brutality. But unlike the owner, he demonstrated a sensitivity that made him secretly question his father's methods. The relationship with the young woman had begun as compassion and evolved into something he couldn't completely understand. The meetings between them began months before when he found her crying after one of his father's particularly cruel experiments. He offered words of comfort, which gradually transformed into longer conversations, then secret meetings, and finally a connection both knew was impossible and dangerous. In him she found gentle, as she'd forgotten could exist. He treated her as a complete human being, not as property or an object of amusement. For a woman living in constant terror, these moments of humanity became vital for her survival. In turn, he discovered in her an intelligence and sensitivity that made him question everything he'd learned about race and property. He began seeing his father's cruelties through his victim's eyes, creating a conscience that tormented him daily. He examined this specific encounter, analyzing every aspect of the interaction between his son and the slave. He noticed the genuine tenderness between them, how they communicated through subtle touches, and how both seemed to find refuge in each other. For his sadistic mind, this dynamic represented fascinating possibilities. The discovery of the relationship completely changed how he understood her recent behavior. Her disappearances weren't signs of collapse, but evidence of a secret life she'd managed to keep hidden. She demonstrated willpower he'd underestimated. He decided not to immediately confront either of them. Instead, he chose to watch and plan, using this information as the basis for a much more elaborate experiment than anything he'd tried before. He discovered a vulnerability in his own son he could exploit in devastating ways. During the following weeks, he continued spying on their meetings, studying patterns and monitoring how the relationship evolved. He noticed how she transformed during these moments, recovering a vitality his experiments had almost destroyed. It was like watching a resurrection that fascinated and irritated him simultaneously. Unaware of his father's surveillance, the son began developing desperate plans to protect her. He considered helping her escape, even knowing this would result in his own social and financial ruin. Love had become more important than his privileged position in society. In turn, she lived in constant terror that the relationship would be discovered. She knew the consequences would be catastrophic not only for her but for him too. Still, these moments of human connection had become her only source of hope in an existence dominated by nightmare. Her brother began suspecting something had changed in his sister's life. He noticed small changes in her behavior, moments of distraction not consistent with her normal pattern of constant watchfulness. But she kept the secret even from him, fearing knowledge could put him in additional danger. During this period of growing tension, the elderly slave made a decision that would change everything. He'd been monitoring the owner's renewed interest in the siblings and knew something terrible was approaching. He'd carried secrets about the Daniels family for decades and decided it was time to reveal at least part of the truth. He sought out the siblings one night when they were alone in their cabin. His expression was grave, loaded with the weight of knowledge he'd guarded for 40 years. He revealed there were things they needed to know about their origins, things that explained why the owner had special interest in them. The siblings exchanged glances, feeling they were about to discover something that would fundamentally change their understanding of their lives. The elder took a deep breath before continuing, knowing his next words would carry devastating weight. He revealed the devastating truth about their origins. They weren't just siblings but half-siblings of the owner's son, all children of the same man. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the very air had been sucked from the cabin. The elder explained how he'd witnessed systematic rape of the siblings' mother for months, a young slave named Mercy who'd arrived at the plantation in 1830. The owner had chosen Mercy specifically for her beauty and youth, subjecting her to regular abuse that resulted in the siblings' conception. The elder described how Mercy tried resisting at first, but he broke her will through cruelties that made current horrors seem mild. She became pregnant first with the brother, then with the sister 2 years later. The owner showed satisfaction at creating children through a slave. The most devastating revelation was yet to come. The elder explained that a third pregnancy occurred but resulted in fatal complications. She died in childbirth along with the child. The owner monitored the entire process, examining every detail, claiming he wanted to learn about the limits of forced reproduction. The siblings absorbed this information in absolute shock. Everything they thought they knew about their origins was a lie. They weren't just slaves. They were children of the very monster who tormented them. And the owner's son, the man she loved, was their half-brother. The elder explained he'd guarded this secret for decades, fearing for his own life if the owner discovered someone knew the truth. But advanced age and illness were evident now, and he saw the owner was planning something terrible for them. They needed to know the truth before it was too late. The revelation created a new layer of terror for the young woman, who now understood her relationship with the son was incestuous. She'd fallen in love with her own half-brother without knowing the family connection. A mixture of guilt and disgust with the love she felt created devastating confusion. Her brother reacted with rage beyond anything he'd felt before. Not only had the owner tormented and humiliated them throughout their entire lives, but he'd done this knowing they were his own children. The betrayal was absolute, touching the most basic foundations of the relationship between father and child. The elder warned that the owner probably knew of the family connection and could be planning to use this knowledge in terrible ways. He'd always known they were his children, and this only made the experiments more interesting to him. He appreciated breaking family bonds. Tension on the plantation increased as he planned his response to discovering the relationship between the young woman and his son. He knew action in a way causing maximum impact on all involved was necessary. The secret relationship had given him a manipulation tool more powerful than any physical instrument. In June 1854, he decided sufficient surveillance had been done. He developed a plan using the relationship between the young woman and his son as the basis for an unprecedented demonstration of cruelty. But first, he needed to create the right conditions to implement his elaborate revenge. He deliberately increased pressure on the young woman, assigning her more difficult tasks and punishing her for imaginary mistakes. He wanted to push her to the point of despair where she'd commit an error justifying an extreme response. The trap was being carefully prepared. Under growing pressure, and now carrying the terrible weight of knowledge about their origins, the young woman began making small errors she'd normally avoid. Her concentration was divided between surviving the experiments, maintaining her secret relationship, and processing the devastating revelation that the son was her half-brother. The summer of 1854 brought oppressive heat mirroring the growing tension on the plantation. All elements were aligning for an explosion he'd carefully prepared. He transformed love into weapon, loyalty into weakness, and hope into an instrument of destruction. On a particularly hot July afternoon, she made the error he'd been waiting for. She arrived 20 minutes late for her household tasks with obvious signs of having been in the abandoned cabin. Her clothes were slightly disheveled, and she carried the subtle smell of old wood that characterized the hideout. He said nothing immediately, but she saw something in his eyes that filled her with absolute terror. She knew with instinctive certainty she'd been discovered. The game of hiding was over, and the consequences would be more terrible than anything she could imagine. The next morning, he called all slaves for a meeting in the plantation's central courtyard. It was uncommon practice that immediately created an atmosphere of tension and fear. The young woman stayed at the back of the group trying to become invisible, but knew she was the real focus of the assembly. He announced the discovery of a grave crime against the plantation's natural order. He explained with the disturbing calm characterizing his most dangerous moments that someone had violated the fundamental rules maintaining social stability. The punishment would be exemplary and educational for all present. Without naming her directly, he described the crime as immoral behavior corrupting racial purity and defying divine authority. He transformed the loving relationship into a transgression, justifying any response, no matter how extreme. Religious and racial language masked his true motivation, sadistic pleasure with human suffering. The young woman's legs weakened when her name was finally called. She approached slowly, each step echoing like a death sentence. Other slaves avoided her gaze, instinctively knowing witnessing her humiliation could result in inclusion in the punishment. He announced she'd been contaminated through improper contact, and purification through a process restoring natural order was necessary. He developed religious language transforming cruelty into a moral mission, making it easier to justify unthinkable acts. The punishment he'd planned was of an atrocity beyond anything he'd tried before. He would force intimate relations with her own brother until she became pregnant. This purification through family blood would supposedly remove the contamination from her relationship with the son. What made the experiment even more diabolical was his perfect knowledge that the siblings were his own children, and that his son was half-brother to both. He'd created a situation where he'd force incest between his own children as punishment for a relationship that was also incestuous, though unknown to those involved. Her brother reacted with absolute revulsion, categorically refusing to participate in such abomination. His resistance was exactly what had been anticipated and planned. The initial refusal would be broken through methods demonstrating the futility of resisting absolute will. He calmly explained her brother's refusal would result in her slow and painful death, followed by the death of all other plantation slaves. He'd created a situation where the only way to save lives was to participate in an act that would destroy both their souls. It was blackmail in its most refined form. She pleaded with her brother to refuse, preferring to die rather than participate in such abomination. But he'd studied the dynamic between the siblings long enough to know the young man couldn't watch his sister's death, no matter the personal cost. Brotherly love would become the instrument of its own destruction. For 3 days, he kept the siblings in separate cells, allowing pressure to build. He made periodic visits to each, describing in graphic detail what would happen if they continued resisting. The anticipation of the abomination became almost as destructive as the act itself. Her brother tried finding desperate alternatives, offering his own life in exchange for his sister's freedom. But he'd planned carefully to eliminate all options except complete submission. Each negotiation attempt was rejected with explanations about why only the specific purification would be acceptable. She entered a state where she tried separating from the reality of her situation. She developed mental withdrawal ability that would help her survive the imminent trauma, but would also permanently mark her ability to form connections. On the 4th day, her brother's resistance finally broke when he brought physical evidence of cruelty applied to other slaves. He deliberately injured several people to demonstrate his willingness to fulfill threats. The suffering of innocence became the final lever to force submission. He'd prepared a special cabin for the experiment, equipped with openings allowing surveillance of every aspect of the process. He transformed the most intimate possible act into a spectacle for his entertainment, removing any vestige of humanity from the situation. The first forced encounter between the siblings was meticulously monitored. He spied through a hidden opening, examining reactions and physical signs of trauma. For him, it was the most fascinating experiment he'd conducted. The siblings tried maintaining some dignity during the abomination, whispering words of forgiveness and love to each other. They developed mental coping methods helping them disconnect from the physical act, transforming it into a shared sacrifice for mutual survival. But deeper marks were left with each encounter. He continued the experiment for weeks, forcing regular encounters while analyzing the cumulative effects of trauma. He noticed how the siblings developed increasingly elaborate ways of coping with the abomination, but also how their stability deteriorated progressively. During this time, the son lived in agony, knowing his secret relationship with her had caused this catastrophe. He tried various times to confront his father but lost courage at the last moment. Guilt was consuming his ability to function normally. The son discovered the truth about his origins through fragments of conversations he heard among slaves after the elder's revelation. Knowing she was his half-sister added a new layer of terror to the situation. He'd fallen in love with his own sister, and now she was being forced into incestuous acts as punishment for their relationship. He also watched the son's suffering with sadistic interest. He'd created a multi-layered experiment affecting not only direct victims, but also involuntary observers. The agony spread like waves affecting everyone with connection to the events. After 2 months of systematic torment, the young woman began showing pregnancy signs. He felt genuine satisfaction at confirmation the experiment had worked in the biological sense. He'd forced life creation through methods destroying the parents' souls. Pregnancy brought a new dimension of terror for her, now carrying permanent physical evidence of trauma. She developed a complex relationship with the developing child, simultaneously loving it as part of her brother and hating it as a symbol of her violation. But terrible ambiguity existed. She couldn't know whether the child was her brother's or the son's. Her secret encounters with the son continued until shortly before discovery, and dates made determining real paternity impossible. This uncertainty became another form of mental torment. Her brother reacted to pregnancy news with a mixture of relief and despair. The end of forced encounters brought some physical relief, but the reality that they'd created a child, through such abomination, introduced new levels of trauma. He began questioning whether life had any meaning in a world where such cruelty was possible. He gave the siblings permission to return to their normal tasks, but continued surveillance with sadistic interest. He wanted to see long-term trauma effects, especially how pregnancy would affect the dynamic between them. The experiment had entered a new phase. She tried finding some purpose in pregnancy, focusing on the love she felt for her brother, and trying to separate this from the terrible circumstances of conception. She developed a way of thinking where the child represented survival of something pure amid absolute corruption. As pregnancy progressed, she began having nightmares about giving birth to a child carrying physical and spiritual marks of trauma. She feared the child would be an extension of the owner's experiments, destined for a life of suffering from birth. Doubt about paternity became an obsession constantly consuming her. She secretly studied the son's and brother's physical characteristics, trying to imagine which one the child would resemble. The uncertainty transformed what should have been maternal preparation into a constant source of anxiety. The elderly slave who'd revealed family secrets monitored developments with growing concern. He knew the owner hadn't finished with his experiments. Pregnancy was just a new phase in a broader plan. He began considering whether he should reveal more secrets he guarded about the Daniels family. The plantation had become a nightmare place where every life was reduced to sadistic entertainment, proof to himself that any human resistance could be broken. He transformed love into an instrument of torment and created agony that would perpetuate through generations. During the 4th month of pregnancy, she began thinking about suicide as the only way to escape the abomination and protect the child from an inevitably terrible future. She'd reached the point where death seemed like liberation, not only for her, but for the innocent life she carried. Her brother noticed his sister's intentions through subtle signs he'd learned to recognize over the years. He tried dissuading her, arguing the child could represent a chance for redemption, a way to create something good from the abomination. But his own words sounded empty even to him. Consumed by guilt and terror of what he'd witnessed, the son secretly began planning a way to end everyone's suffering. He considered killing his own father, knowing this would result in his own death, but seeing it as the only way to break the cycle of cruelty. Absorbed in examining his experiment's effects, the owner initially didn't notice signs his victims were reaching breaking points that could result in desperate actions. His arrogance had become a vulnerability that would be exploited in ways he didn't anticipate. The experiment had achieved success even the owner hadn't completely anticipated. He'd created a situation where his victims considered death as victory, where complete destruction of hope was seen as an act of love. It was the final demonstration of his absolute power over human life. But the abomination he'd created was about to turn against him in ways his sadistic mind couldn't predict. Seeds of his own destruction were planted the moment he decided to transform love into weapon, and the harvest of this cruelty was rapidly approaching. On a cold November morning in 1854, the young woman was found hanged in her cabin using a rope made from strips of fabric torn from her own clothing. She'd chosen a moment when her brother was working in distant fields, sparing him from discovering her body. Even in death, she tried protecting her brother from more terror. The scene her brother found upon returning was of disturbing serenity. She'd positioned herself so she appeared to be sleeping standing up, with an expression of peace contrasting dramatically with the months of abomination she'd endured. She'd left a small corn doll beside her body, a farewell symbol for the child that would never be born. The owner arrived moments after her brother, attracted by the screams of despair echoing across the plantation. He watched the scene with a mixture of sadistic fascination and genuine irritation. She'd ended the experiment prematurely, depriving him of watching pregnancy's effects on the situation's development. Her brother entered a state of complete collapse, alternating between periods of homicidal rage and absolute silence. He'd lost not only his sister, but also the child, representing a complex but real connection with her. Her suicide had broken the last anchor keeping him connected to sanity. He ordered her body left hanging for 3 days as an example for others who might consider defying authority. Really, he wanted to examine how prolonged exposure to visual terror would affect other slaves, especially her brother. Even in death, she continued as an object of cruelty. During these 3 days, her brother remained seated in front of the cabin, refusing to eat, drink, or move. He constantly talked to her body, asking forgiveness and promising to reunite with her soon. Other slaves tried consoling him, but he'd withdrawn to an internal world where only his sister existed. The son monitored from afar, finally understanding the complete extent of the abomination his secret relationship had unleashed. Guilt transformed into physical pain, constantly consuming him. He genuinely loved her, but this love had become the catalyst for her destruction and her brother's. On the 3rd night after the suicide, the son finally found courage to approach her brother. He confessed his relationship with her, explaining his cowardice in not confronting his father had allowed the cruelties to happen. It was an admission he knew could result in his own death. Her brother reacted to the confession with a calm more terrifying than any explosion of rage. He looked at the son with eyes that had lost any vestige of humanity and stated his intention with absolute clarity. The son would help eliminate the owner. It wasn't a question, but a statement of inevitable fact. The son immediately agreed, consumed by guilt and terror of what he'd witnessed. He'd concluded his father represented a force of pure evil needing elimination, no matter the personal cost. His love for her had transformed into absolute hatred for the owner. The two men began secretly planning the owner's death, united by shared guilt and desire for revenge. Her brother contributed intimate knowledge of the owner's habits and vulnerabilities, while the son provided access to areas of the house normally out of reach for a slave. Her brother had developed intimate understanding of the owner's patterns during years of forced surveillance. He knew the owner visited his structures every night between 10 and 11, always alone, always carrying a specific lantern that had belonged to his father. It was a ritual followed religiously. The son revealed his father kept a collection of weapons in his office, but the key was always hidden in a location only the family knew. More importantly, he knew his father had the habit of drinking cognac alone after his nightly inspections, a moment of vulnerability that could be exploited. The plan they developed was brutally simple. Her brother would hide in the main structure, waiting for the owner's arrival for his routine inspection. The son would ensure other escape routes were blocked and provide a weapon. When the owner was isolated and disarmed, her brother would attack. For a week, they studied and refined the plan. They talked in stolen moments when they could be certain they wouldn't be discovered. The irony didn't go unnoticed. They were using survival methods she developed to plan her torturer's destruction. On the night chosen for the assassination, her brother positioned himself in the structure, hidden among the tools he'd seen used on so many fellow slaves. The environment was saturated with the smell of blood and suffering, creating an atmosphere feeding his homicidal determination. The son had obtained a butcher's knife from the kitchen, a heavy blade that would be effective even in her brother's inexperienced hands. He'd also prepared a laudanum mixture in his father's cognac, enough to diminish his reflexes without causing immediate unconsciousness. When the owner arrived for his nightly inspection carrying the familiar lantern, supernatural calm descended upon her brother. All the months of abomination, all her pain, all accumulated rage crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. He knew exactly what needed to be done. The owner entered the structure, methodically checking each tool as he always did. He was absorbed in his routines, completely unaware of her brother's presence in the shadows. His arrogance had become fatal vulnerability. Her brother emerged from hiding with the silence learned during years of trying to avoid attention. He struck the owner in the back with the first stab, penetrating deeply but avoiding the heart. He wanted the owner to suffer before dying. The owner screamed in pain and surprise, turning to face his attacker. When he saw her brother with the bloodied knife, his expression passed through a series of emotions: shock, rage, and finally a kind of recognition. Even facing death, he seemed to understand the poetic justice of the situation. Her brother responded with a second stab, this time in the abdomen, cutting deeply through flesh. He'd watched the owner's experiments long enough to know where it hurt most without allowing quick death. He said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The owner fell to his knees, trying to press his hands against the wounds to stop bleeding. He looked at her brother with an expression mixing physical pain with something that could have been perverse paternal pride. Even dying, he seemed fascinated by his victims. Transformation into predator. The third stab cut the owner's throat, silencing him permanently. Her brother watched life drain from the man's eyes, feeling satisfaction that frightened him with its intensity. He developed capacity to kill, not just from necessity but for pleasure in revenge. The son arrived moments later, finding her brother standing over his father's body, still holding the bloodied knife. The scene was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. They'd eliminated the source of so much suffering, but through methods that marked them permanently. The two men worked together to hide the owner's body in one of the most remote structures, using the man's own tools to dismantle evidence of his existence. It was poetic irony that his instruments became tools of his own erasure. The son officially took over plantation control, claiming his father had left on an indefinite business trip. Neighbors accepted the story, knowing the owner's reclusive nature. No one questioned his prolonged absence or investigated deeply. The son gave her brother official freedom along with all other plantation slaves, but legal freedom couldn't erase the marks he carried. He'd lost not only his sister, but also his own innocence, transforming into something he couldn't completely recognize. The elderly slave who'd revealed family secrets died peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks after the owner's assassination. He'd fulfilled his mission to reveal the truth, and seemed to have found peace knowing the source of so much suffering had been eliminated. The son tried rebuilding his life, but discovered escape from memories of what he'd witnessed and allowed wasn't possible. He sold the plantation within a year and moved north, trying to find redemption through abolitionist work, but was constantly haunted by images of her hanging. Her brother disappeared into Alabama forests, unable to integrate into normal society after everything he'd experienced. Some reported sightings of a solitary man living as a hermit, but he was never seen again in civilized communities. Freedom had arrived too late to save him. Other plantation slaves scattered throughout the South, carrying stories considered too exaggerated to be true. But those who knew them noticed a particular quality in their eyes, a shadow suggesting exposure to horrors beyond normal experience. The plantation was eventually abandoned, its structures left to rot in Alabama forests. Occasional hunters reported an inexplicable sense of unease when passing through the area, as if the land itself had been contaminated by the events it witnessed. Decades later, farmers avoided planting in those specific areas, claiming the soil didn't support adequate growth. It was as if physical marks had been left by the cruelty on the environment itself. The son never married or had children, unable to form intimate connections after witnessing the destruction of love between her and her brother. He died alone in 1889, leaving a considerable fortune to abolitionist causes but no personal legacy beyond guilt and regret. The plantation story transformed into a whispered legend among Alabama's black communities, a cautionary tale about cruelties that could be committed when absolute power met pure evil. But specific details were gradually lost, leaving only a general sense of terror associated with the Daniels name. The ambiguity about the paternity of the child she carried died with her, becoming another secret buried with the plantation's abominations. Whether the child was her brother's or the son's would never be known. But perhaps it was better that way. Some truths are too heavy to be carried by the living. The Daniels plantation remains as a somber reminder of how human cruelty can go beyond even the institutionalized barbarities of slavery. He transformed the property into a nightmare place where every relationship became a tool of torment, where love was used as a weapon against those who felt it. What makes this story particularly chilling aren't just the individual acts of cruelty, but the systematic way he exploited the most fundamental human connections. He instinctively understood emotional agony could be more destructive than physical pain, and used this knowledge to create experiments destroying souls beyond bodies. The siblings represent the tragedy of victims forced to become accomplices in their own destruction. Their brotherly love, which should have been a source of strength, was transformed into an instrument of their ruin. The revelation they were children of their own torturer added a layer of abomination beyond any fiction. The relationship between her and the son carries the cruel irony of genuine love that was, without their knowledge, incestuous from the beginning. The ambiguity about the paternity of the child she carried symbolizes how the cruelties contaminated even the possibility of redemption through new life. The son carries the particular guilt of those possessing power to intervene but failing to act until too late. His love for her was genuine, but his cowardice allowed her to be destroyed by his father's methods. The final revenge brought justice but not redemption. The elder represents the silent wisdom of those who witness cruelties but must guard secrets to survive. His final decision to reveal the truth about family origins demonstrates how even the most vulnerable can find courage when confronted with absolute evil. The plantation forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the limits of human resistance. The owner wasn't a supernatural monster, but a man who deliberately chose to exploit and amplify human suffering. His evil was entirely human, making it even more terrifying. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story is how it demonstrates that even in humanity's darkest moments, there's always potential for cruelties exceeding already brutal norms. Slavery was a terrible institution, but creation of abominations shocking even those accustomed to systematic brutality was possible. The marks left by these events extended far beyond direct victims, affecting generations through whispered stories and transmitted memories. The evil committed created waves continuing to spread long after his death, proving some actions have consequences transcending their perpetrators' lives. This story reminds us that human capacity for cruelty is limited only by imagination and opportunity. But it also demonstrates that even in the most desperate circumstances, love can persist. Even when used as a weapon against those who feel it, the siblings maintained their humanity until the end, even when it became the source of their suffering. If this story moved you and you want to explore more of humanity's darkest chapters, subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America. We bring you the most chilling stories revealing what people are truly capable of when power goes unchecked. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because some stories are too powerful to remain untold.